In rural Nebraska, 73-year-old Edith Jenkins, a widow and mother who lost her son Thomas in Iraq, bakes cookies every Friday for soldiers, sending them anonymously with heartfelt notes. Despite her arthritis and the town's growing skepticism, she persists, driven by love for her son and a promise to honor his memory. Her quiet ritual, spanning years, goes unnoticed until a tin reaches Captain Eric Langford in Iraq, who knew Thomas. The note inside rekindles a buried memory, setting in motion an extraordinary plan to honor Edith's unwavering kindness, hinting at a heartfelt tribute yet to unfold. If Edith's story touched your heart, join us in celebrating quiet acts of kindness. Like, subscribe, and share this video to inspire others. Your support helps us tell stories that matter. Comment below with your own stories of kindness. Let's keep the ripple of love going strong. Thank you. In the gentle embrace of dawn, long before the first light kissed the rolling fields of rural Nebraska, Edith Mae Jenkins stirred from her slumber. Every Friday, without fail, she rose in the quiet hours, not for recognition or companionship, but for a ritual born of love and loss. In her modest kitchen, she baked cookies, simple, heartfelt offerings of butter and sugar, crafted with care and sent to strangers in uniform. No name adorned the return address, only the silent signature of a mother who carried the weight of memory. She never expected a reply, and none ever came. Yet, through howling storms, aching joints, and the heavy stillness of solitude, Edith baked. Her heart, though scarred, beat with unwavering resolve. Then, one fateful morning, the sky roared with a ferocity that shook the earth. A Black Hawk helicopter descended into her cornfield, its blades slicing through the Nebraska quiet. 6 soldiers, resplendent in their dress uniforms, stepped onto her land. One cradled a folded flag. Another held her son's dog tag, glinting faintly in the dawn. For the first time, Edith, the unassuming woman in a flour-dusted apron, heard words that pierced the silence of her grief. No letter ever carried. Who was she to make the military come for her? Nestled in the heartland of Fairview, Nebraska, down a winding dirt road framed by golden wheat and whispering corn, stood Edith's small white farmhouse. Its weathered shutters and creaking porch swing spoke of time's gentle wear. But to Edith, it was a sanctuary, a vessel for a lifetime of memories. At 73, she carried herself with a quiet dignity, as though she had lived not one life but several, each layered with joy and sorrow. Her movements were deliberate now, slowed by age and the faint ache of arthritis, but her hands, speckled with the marks of time, had kneaded countless batches of dough, stirred endless bowls of batter, and shaped a legacy of love through her baking. Fairview was her world, a place she'd never left, not for the allure of college, not for distant dreams, and not even when grief threatened to unravel her. Born to a mechanic father who could fix anything with a wrench and a piano teacher, mother whose music filled their home, Edith had roots sunk deep into Nebraska's soil. Her heart had once belonged to Carl, her high school sweetheart, and a Korean War veteran whose steady presence had been her anchor. They married young, their days filled with the clucking of chickens, the aroma of fresh peas, and the laughter of their only child, Thomas. He was her pride, a boy with a crooked smile and a soul older than his years. As a child, Thomas trailed her in the kitchen, sneaking bits of dough and carrying warm pies to neighbors with a shy grin. She could still see him, standing tall in his marine dress blues, his eyes bright with purpose, as he spoke of serving something greater than himself, echoing his father's call to duty. But in the world Edith knew shattered. A knock at the door brought 2 uniformed men, their faces heavy with the news no mother could ever prepare for. Corporal Thomas Jenkins, her only son, had been killed by a roadside bomb near Fallujah. He was just 23. The loss carved a hollow in her heart, one she carried quietly, never seeking to fill it with new love or new places. She stayed, rooted to the farmhouse, to Fairview, to the life she and Carl had built. Widowed and alone, Edith never remarried, never moved. She retired after 4 decades as Fairview High's beloved lunch lady, where her warm smile and homemade rolls had been a comfort to generations of students. Now her days were filled with small, meaningful rituals. Sunday mornings at Zion Baptist, where she still taught Sunday school with a gentle patience. evenings spent reading scripture by lamplight, and annual trips to the county fair, where her peach pies, legendary for their flaky crusts and sweet, sun-ripened filling, claimed blue ribbons almost every year. But it wasn't the accolades that drove her. It was the memory of Thomas, his boyish laughter as he swiped peaches from the counter, his sticky fingers leaving traces of joy. His photograph hung in the living room beside the family Bible, a constant reminder of the boy who had been her world. Her only companion now was Duke, a golden retriever with a graying muzzle who padded faithfully at her side, his warm presence a quiet comfort in her solitary days. Edith lived simply, her pension and Social Security just enough to keep the farmhouse standing and the pantry stocked. She had no use for smartphones or social media, no patience for the world's relentless pace. Yet beneath her unassuming exterior, the wound of losing Thomas lingered, a quiet ache that never fully eased. Each batch of cookies she baked was a prayer, a way to honor her son's memory, to reach out to others who served as he had. She imagined the soldiers opening her packages, perhaps smiling at the taste of home, perhaps thinking of their own mothers. It was her way of keeping Thomas alive, of weaving her love into the world, even if it went unnoticed. But the world, it seemed, had not forgotten. That morning, as the helicopter's roar faded and the soldiers stood before her, Edith's heart pounded with a mix of fear and wonder. The folded flag, the dog tag, symbols of her son's sacrifice, brought a flood of memories, his first steps, his laughter, his quiet determination. The soldier's words echoed in her mind, a testament to the quiet power of her love. She had never sought recognition, never imagined her simple acts would ripple so far. Yet here they were, honoring not just Thomas but her, a mother who had turned her grief into something beautiful, something that reached beyond the fields of Nebraska to touch lives she would never know. On a crisp autumn evening, the wind howled outside Edith Jenkins' weathered farmhouse, rattling the windows as if desperate to slip inside. The widow, in her late 60s, sat alone in her living room, wrapped in a soft, lavender-scented blanket her mother had knitted decades ago. The television flickered, casting shadows across the faded photographs on the mantel, snapshots of a life filled with love and loss. Her golden retriever Duke sprawled at her feet, his snores a gentle counterpoint to the evening news. The broadcast, halfway through a segment on Syria, showed dusty, weary soldiers resting under a tarp. One young man, barely older than her son Thomas had been, grinned shyly at the camera. "I miss my mom's chocolate chip cookies more than anything," he said, his voice thick with longing. "Just one batch would fix everything." The words struck Edith like a thunderbolt, her throat tightening as memories of Thomas flooded back. Her son, her only child, had been gone for years, lost to a war that still haunted her. She thought of his letters from Iraq, tucked away in a wooden box marked Tommy, tied with a faded green ribbon. In one, he'd written of her oatmeal cookies, how his squad had fought over them, how they tasted like home. Tears welled in her eyes, pride and grief intertwining. Slowly she rose, steadying herself on the armchair, and shuffled to the kitchen. For the first time in months, she turned on the oven, its hum a call to action. She didn't know who would eat her cookies, but she baked anyway. Chocolate chip and snickerdoodles, each placed in a tin with a note. "To any soldier far from home, stay safe." Baked with care from a mother who remembers. The next Friday, Edith stood at the Fairview post office, her tin wrapped in brown paper, addressed to Fort Freedom, Colorado. A base she'd never seen. The young clerk, puzzled but kind, processed the package, and Edith felt a spark of purpose ignite. This was the start of a ritual that would span years. Every Friday before dawn, she'd rise, her arthritis flaring but her resolve unshaken. In her blue cardigan and Thomas's old apron, she'd mix dough by hand, the kitchen filling with the scent of vanilla and cinnamon. Each tin carried a handwritten note, "From a mother who understands or you're not forgotten," a small offering to soldiers she'd never meet. Months passed without a reply, but Edith never wavered. On days when pain made her hands tremble, she worked from a stool. When her car failed, she borrowed a ride or walked, cane in hand, the tin cradled like a treasure. Each package was a quiet vow, a way to honor Thomas and send a piece of home to someone who needed it. a ripple of love from her small kitchen to the far corners of the world. Edith Mae Jenkins clutched her tote bag, the weight of freshly baked cookies nestled inside, their warmth still lingering from the oven. Each Friday she embarked on this ritual with a quiet determination, her heart tethered to a promise that had taken root decades ago. She had missed church services a few times, her pew empty during sermons, and she'd skipped the chatter-filled social lunches at the diner. But Fridays? Those were untouchable, sacred in a way that went beyond habit. For Edith, they were a lifeline to a past she refused to let fade, a vow to her late husband Thomas, to herself, and to every soldier who might feel the same aching loneliness she had once known. In her small kitchen, the world's clamor fell silent, and her hands, though slower now, worked with a steady purpose, tying ribbons around tins with a tenderness that felt like a whispered prayer. In Fairview, the town had taken notice of her routine, though not always with kindness. Some folks offered warm smiles, their eyes glinting with curiosity about the woman who sent cookies to soldiers week after week. Others, however, met her dedication with skepticism, their eye rolls sharp as they muttered under their breath. At the grocery store one afternoon, as Edith placed her usual order of flour and sugar on the counter, the young cashier leaned toward a coworker and whispered, "She's still doing that cookie thing." The words weren't meant for her ears, but they stung all the same. Edith's lips curved into a gentle smile, betraying none of the ache that flickered in her chest. She didn't beg for their approval or their whispers. Each cookie she shaped, each note she penned, was a quiet act of defiance against a world that seemed to prize noise over substance. Her consistency wasn't about being seen, it was about being faithful, a courage born of quiet resolve in a town that often mistook her steadfastness for something else. By the second year of her ritual, Edith had become something of an enigma in Fairview. At Linda's Cafe, where the air smelled of coffee and pie, her nickname, the Cookie Lady, floated through conversations, sometimes laced with warmth, sometimes with a bite of disdain. The story of her weekly packages had sifted through the town like flour through a sieve, its truth muddled by half-remembered details and embellished gossip. Over slices of apple pie, one woman murmured, "She's still mailing those cookies to the army, isn't she?" Her friend, stirring sugar into her coffee, replied with a scoff, "Just fishing for attention. You know how lonely old folks get." The words hung heavy, their judgment settling like dust. Even at Zion Baptist, where Edith had poured her heart into teaching Sunday school for over 30 years, the air had shifted. Her prayer requests, once met with nods and clasped hands, were now glossed over in silence. Her warm greetings were returned with tight-lipped smiles, polite but distant. During coffee hour, conversations hushed as she approached, the silence not cruel but hollow, a subtle rejection that cut deeper than words. The sharpest wound came from an unexpected place, Harrison's Hardware, a store woven into her memories of Thomas. Decades ago, he'd used his first part-time paycheck to buy her a set of baking pans there, his grin wide as he handed them to her, promising they'd make countless batches together. Now the store was run by the owner's son, a man with a brisk manner and eyes that avoided hers. When Edith inquired about the usual discount on flour and parchment paper, he cleared his throat, his voice flat. "We're not doing personal discounts anymore," he said, his gaze fixed on the counter. "Maybe try ordering online." The suggestion landed like a dismissal, and for a moment Edith felt the weight of her isolation, the sting of being pushed aside by a place that had once felt like home. She nodded, her smile unwavering, and left with her head high, though her heart ached with the memory of simpler days. Then came the blog post, penned by a young journalist eager to stir the pot. The headline screamed, "Grandstanding Granny, Local Woman's Cookie Campaign Sparks Debate." The article painted her efforts as a calculated performance, a bid for attention cloaked in patriotic sentiment. It accused her of exploiting veterans' emotions, calling her cookies performative nostalgia rather than genuine charity. They hadn't even bothered to ask her side, hadn't sat across from her to see the quiet resolve in her eyes or the care she poured into each handwritten note. The post spread through Fairview's online circles, modest but venomous, and the ripples reached her daily life. The post office clerk, once chatty and kind, now offered only curt nods as he processed her packages. Her neighbor, Martha, who used to wave from her porch, now turned away when Edith passed by. Even the grocery cashier hesitated before asking, "Still sending those cookies?" The question carried a trace of judgment, as if her persistence was a puzzle no one cared to solve. But Edith didn't falter. She didn't raise her voice, didn't fire back with a letter to the editor or a comment on the blog. Instead, she returned to her kitchen, where the scent of cinnamon and sugar filled the air like a balm. Her hands, though stiff with age, moved with the same care as always, shaping each cookie as if it were a small offering of hope. Her notes, written in her careful script, held no trace of bitterness. Only warmth, only compassion. She baked not for praise or recognition, but because she remembered. She remembered Thomas, his laughter, his pride in her baking. She remembered the letters from soldiers, their words scrawled in shaky hands, thanking her for a taste of home. She baked because somewhere a soldier was tired, homesick, unseen, and her cookies might be the only reminder that someone, somewhere cared. If the world had grown too cynical to understand that, she'd keep baking anyway. Her quiet rebellion against a tide of indifference. It was Friday morning, as it always was. The house sat still, bathed in the soft, dim light of dawn. Edith moved slower now, her joints protesting with each step, but her spirit remained unyielding. She pulled her apron over her head, the fabric worn but familiar, and began her work. The kitchen came alive with the hum of her routine, measuring flour, cracking eggs, stirring batter with a wooden spoon that had seen decades of Fridays. Each motion was a meditation, each cookie a testament to her unwavering heart. In a world that rushed past her, Edith Mae Jenkins chose to stand still, to bake, to remember. And that, she knew, was its own kind of courage. Edith Jenkins moved through her small kitchen with a quiet determination, though her hands ached with a deep, persistent throb, each joint stiff and swollen, as if protesting the years of labor they'd endured. Her knees, too, sent sharp stabs of pain with every step, but she refused to falter. Routine was her salvation, a fragile thread of order in a life that had been upended long ago. For 416 weeks, she had honored this ritual, and to abandon it now would feel like betraying the memory that kept her going. The kitchen was warm, filled with the rich, buttery scent of freshly baked chocolate chip cookies cooling on a wire rack. Their edges were golden and slightly crisp, just the way Thomas had liked them. The center soft and yielding, a perfect balance of sweetness and comfort. She could still see him in her mind's eye, her son, all lanky limbs and boyish grin, sneaking an extra cookie when he thought she wasn't watching, his eyes sparkling with mischief. The memory was a knife, sharp and tender, but she clung to it, letting it anchor her to the past. She reached for her note cards, her fingers trembling more than usual, the weight of the pen unfamiliar in her grip. She began to write, each letter a deliberate act of will, her handwriting shaky but resolute. Halfway through, the pen slipped, leaving a dark blue smear across the page, a blemish that felt like a small betrayal. She stared at it, her heart heavy with frustration. Normally, she would have torn the card to pieces, started over, demanded perfection as a way to honor the task. But today, something stopped her. Perhaps it was the pain that seemed to seep into her very bones, a chill no blanket could banish. Or maybe it was the weight of all those Fridays, each one a marker of grief and stubborn hope, piling up until they pressed against her chest. Or perhaps it was simply time to let the imperfection stand, to let the truth speak for itself. So she continued, her words simple and unadorned. My son loved these before he was taken from me. No flourish, no explanation. Just the raw truth, written in ink that carried the weight of her loss. She folded the note with care, her fingers lingering on the edges as if they could hold on to the moment a little longer. She tucked it beneath the wax paper, nestled among the cookies, and sealed the tin with a soft blue ribbon, tying it with the same precision she'd used for years. Then, cradling the tin in her arms, she made her slow, deliberate way to the post office. The clerk barely looked up, his face as expressionless as the gray counter between them. But Edith didn't care. She wasn't here for pleasantries. The package was on its way, carrying a piece of her heart to some distant corner of the world, just as it always did. What Edith couldn't have known was that this tin would travel farther than most, crossing oceans and continents to a desolate place called Firewatch Outpost in northern Iraq. It arrived at a wind-battered, dust-covered base where it sat among crates of gear, tattered mailbags, and stale rations, an unassuming fragment of home in a world of harsh edges and muted colors. Days passed before a soldier, worn thin by the relentless grind of war, noticed it. Captain Eric Langford hadn't planned to open the tin that day. The mail had arrived late, as it often did, and the heat was unforgiving, coating everything in a fine layer of desert grit that clung to skin and gear alike. His unit had just returned from a punishing 48-hour patrol, their boots caked with dust, their spirits frayed and fragile. Morale was low, tempers sharp and brittle, ready to snap under the weight of exhaustion. The tin sat on his desk, an oddity among the stark metal and beige monotony of the outpost. It was old-fashioned, wrapped in wax paper and tied with a ribbon that seemed too soft, too delicate for this place. It stirred something in him, a faint memory he couldn't yet place, a whisper of something softer than the world around him. He opened it absently, expecting the usual, crushed crackers or dried fruit, the kind of thing that could survive the long journey to a place like this. Instead, the scent of home washed over him, warm and impossibly familiar. The cookies were soft, golden, their edges slightly crumbled but still whole, still real. They were the kind of cookies no one at Firewatch Outpost had tasted in months, the kind that carried the memory of quiet evenings and warm kitchens. Then he saw the note. The handwriting was shaky, the ink smudged, but the words were clear. My son loved these before he was taken from me. Eric froze, his breath catching in his throat. He read the return address again, E. Jenkins, Fairview, Nebraska, and something broke open inside him, a crack in the armor he'd built to survive this place. Jenkins. Thomas Jenkins. The name hit him like a physical blow, sharp and unrelenting. He reached into his desk drawer, his hands moving on instinct, pulling out a worn, laminated photograph. The edges were frayed, the image faded, but it was still clear enough. A snapshot of his unit from years ago, young faces full of hope and bravado. Most of them were gone now, their names carved into stone or carried in the quiet grief of those left behind. And there, in the back row, third from the left, was Corporal Thomas Jenkins. Tall, quiet, steady as a rock. Eric closed his eyes and the memory came flooding back, vivid and merciless. The roadside, the choking dust, the moment of eerie silence before the world erupted. Thomas had been the one to shout, his voice cutting through the haze. IED, a warning that saved lives. 2 men walked away that day because of Thomas, because he'd been paying attention when no one else was. Eric had knelt beside him afterward, cradling him as the medevac chopper roared overhead, its blades slicing through the air. In those final moments, Thomas had looked at him, his eyes clear despite the pain, and Eric had felt the weight of a promise he couldn't keep, to bring him home. Captain Eric Langford sat alone in his sparse quarters, the relentless desert wind howling outside, a low moan that seemed to carry the weight of years gone by. His hands, steady in battle, now shook, not from fear but from a flood of memories that refused to stay buried. In his lap rested a simple tin, its edges worn, containing not just cookies but a piece of a past he'd tried to outrun. A handwritten note, folded with care, lay beside it, its words piercing through the armor he'd built around his heart. Edith Jenkins, a mother he'd never met, hadn't just sent sweets. She'd sent a fragment of her son, Thomas, a soldier whose final moments Eric had witnessed, whose last words had seared themselves into his soul. Tell Mom I love her. Tell her I'm sorry. For years, Eric had carried those words like a stone in his chest, heavy and unyielding. He'd buried them deep, convinced that speaking them would only deepen the pain, for Edith, for himself. But now, with the tin in his hands, the scent of snickerdoodles mingling with the arid air, the promise he'd failed to keep clawed its way back to the surface. Thomas's voice echoed in his mind, faint but insistent, spoken through the agony of that day in the dust and chaos. Eric's throat tightened as he traced the edge of the note, his fingers lingering on the careful loops of Edith's handwriting. She didn't know, she couldn't know how much her son had loved her, how his final thoughts had been of her. And yet, here she was, sending love into the void, her cookies a quiet testament to a heart that refused to break. That night, sleep eluded Eric. He perched on the edge of his cot, the cookie tin glinting faintly in the dim light, the note now unfolded in his hands. His eyes burned, not from exhaustion, but from the weight of a truth he could no longer ignore. For 8 years, he'd carried the guilt of silence, the shame of a promise unfulfilled. Thomas had been more than a soldier under his command. He'd been a friend, a brother in arms, a man whose laughter could cut through the darkest nights. Eric's mind drifted to the moments before that fateful day. Thomas's grin as he shared stories of his mother's baking, his pride in her resilience, his quiet vow to make it home to her. Eric had promised to bring him back. He'd failed, but this tin, this note, it was a second chance, a call to action he couldn't ignore. By the time the first rays of dawn crept through the window, Eric's resolve had hardened. This wasn't a matter for bureaucracy, for sterile reports or folded flags sent through impersonal channels. This was personal, raw, and real. It demanded more than protocol. It demanded heart. He began quietly, his movements deliberate, as he reached out to the men who'd served alongside Thomas, the last remnants of their unit scattered across the country. Some were retired, living quiet lives. Others were still in uniform, stationed far from the desert where they'd lost their brother. Each call was a journey into the past, a reopening of wounds that had never fully healed. But when Eric spoke Thomas's name, when he shared the story of Edith's cookies, there was no hesitation. "Yes, sir," they said, their voices thick with emotion, wherever, whenever. They remembered Thomas's laugh, his courage, his love for his mother. They too carried pieces of him, and they would honor him now. Eric's next call was to a friend in the Nebraska National Guard, a man he'd known since their early days in training. It wasn't an official request. Rank and regulations fell away in the face of what Eric was asking. "She's been baking for soldiers every Friday for 8 years, he said, his voice steady but laced with awe. "She never asks for anything in return, never seeks the spotlight. She just keeps sending her love, not knowing if it reaches us. I think it's time we show her it has." There was a long pause on the line, the kind that spoke of shared understanding, of a bond forged in service. Then softly, "We'll make it happen." No fanfare, no cameras, just a quiet moment of gratitude, a private salute to a woman whose steadfast care had touched the hearts of men who'd never forgotten her son. With meticulous care, Eric planned the tribute. It wouldn't be grand or showy, it would be intimate, sincere, a moment that belonged to Edith and the men who owed her more than words could express. He arranged for a Black Hawk transport, off-duty but sanctioned, its crew volunteering without a second thought. The men would wear their dress blues, crisp and solemn, a symbol of the respect they carried. A folded flag would be presented, not as a gesture of loss, but of enduring honor. A handcrafted plaque engraved with Edith's name would serve as a tangible reminder of her impact. And most importantly, Eric would bring Thomas's dog tags, the ones he'd carried close to his heart since that day, their faint clink a constant reminder of his debt. This plan existed outside the rulebooks, beyond the reach of Pentagon memos or media headlines. It was a quiet act of love, a history written not in history books, but in the heart of one woman, in one backyard, in one small Nebraska town. When the day was set, Eric folded Edith's note one final time, its edges soft from his touch, and placed it back in the tin. He packed his dress blues with care, his fingers lingering on the fabric as he steeled himself for what lay ahead. This wasn't just a mission, it was a reckoning, a chance to lay a promise to rest. As he boarded the transport, the hum of the rotors seemed to echo the resolve in his chest. It was time to bring gratitude home, to land where it had been soaring, unacknowledged for far too long. In a modest farmhouse on the outskirts of a quiet Nebraska town, Edith Jenkins stood at her kitchen counter, the air thick with the warm scent of vanilla and freshly baked snickerdoodles. The sun was just beginning to melt the frost on the fields outside, casting a soft glow through the window. A radio played faintly, its music a gentle hum beneath the steady tick of the old wall clock. Edith's hands, gnarled by arthritis, moved with practiced care as she tied a ribbon around the last cookie tin, her fingers trembling more than usual. Her legs had ached, a dull pain that had grown worse with each passing year, but she pressed on, her resolve unshaken. For 8 years, she'd baked every Friday, pouring her love into each batch, sending them to soldiers she'd never meet. It was her way of keeping Thomas close, of believing somehow that he was still out there, waiting for her cookies. Edith's heart was a tapestry of grief and hope, woven together by years of quiet perseverance. She thought of Thomas constantly, his bright eyes, his infectious laugh, the way he'd sneak extra cookies from the tin when he thought she wasn't looking. She'd lost him, but she hadn't lost her love for him, and baking was her way of holding on to that love, of sending it out into the world where he might still feel it. Each tin was a prayer, a whisper into the unknown, a hope that her son's memory lived on in the hearts of those who fought as he had. She didn't know if her cookies reached the soldiers, didn't know if they mattered. But she baked anyway, because stopping would mean letting go of Thomas, and that was something she could never do. As she reached for another ribbon, her knees buckled, a sharp pain shooting through her legs. The tin slipped from her grasp, clattering to the floor, the sound jarring in the quiet kitchen. Edith caught herself against the counter, her breath hitching as she fought back tears. Not from the pain, but from the sudden, overwhelming weight of her loneliness. She was tired, so tired, but she wouldn't stop. Not for herself, not for Thomas. Slowly, she bent to retrieve the tin, her hands shaking as she brushed away the crumbs that had spilled. She didn't hear the distant hum of the Black Hawk approaching, didn't know that her love had reached further than she could ever imagine, or that in a matter of moments, a promise long delayed was about to come home. The kitchen was a warm cocoon of cinnamon and sugar, the scent of freshly baked cookies wrapping around Edith Jenkins like a soft shawl. Her hands, weathered by decades of kneading dough and tending gardens, trembled slightly as she lifted the tin from the oven. Her heart fluttered with a quiet pride. She'd always made these for her niece Ellie, who was due home from college any moment for fall break. But the weight of this tin felt heavier than usual, her knees unsteady beneath her frail frame. As she turned to set it on the counter, her foot caught on the edge of the linoleum, and the world tilted. The tin slipped from her grasp, crashing to the floor in a chaotic symphony of clattering metal and crumbling cookies. They scattered across the tiles like fallen leaves, each broken piece a small betrayal of her fading strength. Edith reached for the table's edge, her fingers brushing the worn wood, but her body betrayed her too. She crumpled to the cold floor, her breath stolen by the impact, her chest heaving as she tried to pull herself upright. She sat there, dazed, the world spinning softly around her, the cookies a silent testament to her fragility. Ellie pushed through the back door, her backpack slung over one shoulder, her face bright with the anticipation of seeing her aunt. The sight before her stopped her cold. The kitchen, usually a haven of order and warmth, was a scene of quiet chaos. Cookies lay shattered across the floor, and there, slumped beside them, was Aunt Edith, her face pale but her eyes sharp, glinting with a mix of embarrassment and stubborn pride. Ellie's heart lurched, a pang of fear slicing through her. She dropped to her knees beside her aunt, her hands gentle but firm as she helped Edith sit up. "Aunt Edith, oh my God, are you okay?" Her voice trembled, thick with worry. "You should have called me. You can't be doing this alone, not like this." Edith shook her head, her thin lips pressing into a faint, defiant line. "It's Friday," she whispered, her voice barely audible, as if that explained everything. As if the routine of baking for Ellie's arrival was a sacred duty she refused to surrender. Ellie's eyes stung with unshed tears, her throat tight as she saw the fierce independence in her aunt's gaze, now softened by vulnerability. She helped Edith to a kitchen chair, wrapping her in a quilt that smelled faintly of lavender and home. As Ellie swept up the broken cookies, her movements were mechanical, her mind racing with guilt for not being there sooner, for not insisting Edith take it easier. Then a low rumble broke the quiet, a deep vibration that seemed to rise from the earth itself. It started faint, like distant thunder rolling across the horizon, but it grew, insistent, until the windows rattled in their frames. Toms. The teacups in the cabinet clinked nervously, their delicate chime a counterpoint to the growing roar. Ellie froze, broom in hand, her heart pounding as the sound became unmistakable. A rhythmic whump, whump, whump of heavy rotor blades slicing through the air. She glanced at Edith, whose eyes widened with a flicker of curiosity cutting through her exhaustion. "Aunt Edith," Ellie said, her voice urgent, "you need to see this." She moved to the window, her breath catching as she peered out. The sky beyond the farmhouse was alive with motion and light. A Black Hawk helicopter hovered above the cornfield, its blades whipping the golden stalks into a frenzied dance, sending leaves and dust swirling in a golden haze. It was a surreal sight, like something from a dream or a war movie, utterly out of place in the quiet expanse of their rural world. The chopper descended with a slow, deliberate grace, a steel behemoth returning to earth, its presence both majestic and jarring. Neighbors spilled from their homes, some barefoot, others still in housecoats, their faces a mix of awe and disbelief. Cell phones were raised, capturing the moment, while mouths hung open, words lost in the roar. The helicopter touched down in the open pasture behind Edith's house, flattening the grass and stirring memories buried deep in the soil. The noise was overwhelming, a physical force that pressed against Ellie's chest, and then abruptly it faded to a low hum as the blades slowed. The doors slid open and 6 soldiers in pristine dress uniforms stepped out, moving with the precision of a well-rehearsed ritual. The late morning sun caught their medals and polished shoes, casting glints of light that danced across the field. One soldier held a folded flag, its edges crisp and solemn. Another clutched a weathered dog tag, its chain swaying gently in the breeze, a small relic heavy with meaning. Ellie helped Edith to the back door, her aunt's frail form leaning heavily on her arm. Edith stood there, her cardigan clutched tightly against the chill, her eyes wide but resolute, as if bracing herself for something she'd long awaited but never dared hope for. The wind settled, and the dust swirled in the golden sunlight as the soldiers parted, revealing a figure at their center. Captain Eric Langford stepped forward, his polished shoes crunching softly on the gravel path leading to the porch. His face was steady, but his eyes held a storm of emotions, grief, gratitude, and a quiet resolve. Edith's grip on Ellie's arm tightened, her breath hitching as she watched him approach. Her heart pounded, a mix of dread and anticipation, as if the past were about to collide with the present. Langford stopped before her, his posture rigid but his gaze soft. Without hesitation, he raised his right hand in a crisp salute, the gesture sharp and reverent. "Ma'am," he said, his voice clear and steady, cutting through the quiet. "I'm Captain Eric Langford, United States Marine Corps. I served alongside your son, Corporal Thomas Jenkins." The name landed like a sacred invocation, reverberating through the still air. Edith gasped, her free hand flying to her lips, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. The world seemed to pause, the breeze holding its breath with her. Thomas, her Tommy, her boy, lost to a war that had taken so much more than just his life. The memories flooded back, his lopsided grin, his stubborn determination. The way he'd promised to come home. Langford's voice softened, cracking slightly at the edges, betraying the weight he carried. "I was with him the day we lost him," he continued, his words deliberate, each one a stone laid in a monument of memory. "He saved 2 of us that morning, called out the IED before it could take us all. If he hadn't, I wouldn't be standing here today." Ellie's chest tightened, her eyes blurring as she watched her aunt's face crumple, then steady, as if summoning every ounce of strength she had left. Langford reached into his breast pocket, his movements careful, almost reverent, and drew out a weathered dog tag, its thin chain coiled like a fragile thread of memory in his palm. "I've carried this with me for years," he said, his voice barely above a whisper now, thick with emotion. "I didn't know what to do with it until now." He stepped closer, his hand steady despite the tremor in his heart, and placed the dog tag gently into Edith's trembling hand. Her fingers closed around it, the metal cool against her skin, a tangible piece of her son returned to her after so many years. She looked down at it, her breath catching as she traced the engraved name, her heart swelling with a grief that was both unbearable and sacred. Ellie's arm tightened around her aunt, her own tears falling silently, as the soldiers stood in solemn formation, honoring a mother, a son, and a sacrifice that had finally come home. The old wooden porch creaked under the weight of memory as Edith Mae Jenkins stood there, her weathered hands trembling. In her palm lay a dog tag, its metal surface dulled by years of wear, but the name etched into it, Thomas Jenkins, her only son, shone as clear as the day she'd last seen him. Her heart stuttered, caught in a tangle of grief and disbelief. She hadn't heard his name spoken aloud in so long, not like this, not with such weight. The crowd gathered on her lawn stood hushed, their eyes fixed on her, waiting for her to speak. But words felt distant, unreachable, as if they'd been buried with Tommy all those years ago. Instead, she curled her fingers around the dog tag, holding it so tightly it pressed into her skin, a silent prayer that maybe, just maybe, he was still with her. Captain Langford, his uniform crisp but his face softened by something deeper, stepped to the side. Another Marine, younger, with eyes that carried the weight of far-off places, moved forward. In his hands was a polished wooden plaque, its surface gleaming in the late afternoon sun. Langford's voice, steady but thick with emotion, broke the silence. "Edith Mae Jenkins," he began, his words deliberate, "for 8 years of faithful service to the spirits of the deployed, we honor you." He paused, his gaze steady on her, as if he could see the countless nights she'd spent in her small kitchen, flour-dusted hands shaping cookies, her heart pouring love into every batch. Through storm, silence, and sacrifice, your cookies crossed oceans. They reached soldiers who felt forgotten, reminding them they were still held in someone's thoughts. And in my darkest moment, ma'am, they saved my life. Edith's breath caught. Her mind raced back to those Fridays, week after week, when she'd bake until the kitchen smelled of sugar and warmth, packaging each cookie with a handwritten note. She'd started it for Tommy, a promise to keep him close even when war had taken him far away. After he didn't come home, she kept baking, not because she had to, but because stopping would have meant letting go of him entirely. She hadn't known, not really, where those cookies went. She'd imagined them in his hands, maybe shared with his buddies in some dusty tent. But 7 countries? Her cookies had traveled to 7 countries, passed from soldier to soldier, shared in bunkers under flickering lights, opened on lonely Christmas Eves, savored in the chaos of sandstorms or the eerie calm after firefights. The thought overwhelmed her, a tidal wave of realization that her small act of love had rippled further than she could have dreamed. Tears slipped down her cheeks, warm and quiet, carving paths through the lines of a face that had known too much loss. She tried to speak, to say something, anything, but her throat tightened and the words stayed trapped. Instead, she clutched the plaque to her chest, its smooth wood a contrast to the jagged edges of her grief. In her other hand, the dog tag pressed harder, a tether to Tommy, to the boy who'd promised her, "Ma, I'll get those cookies to the guys who need 'em." Langford's eyes met hers, shining with unshed tears of his own. "Some soldiers never knew your name, ma'am," he said softly, "but they felt your care. You reminded us why we fight, for home, for love, for people like you." The crowd was silent, the air heavy with the weight of his words. Langford's voice softened further, almost a whisper now. "We don't have an official title for what you've done, but we have something better." He turned, gesturing to the line of soldiers behind him, their faces a mix of gratitude and pride. "We call you a mother of honor. Thousands of us, scattered across the world, will never forget what you did, week after week, without asking for anything in return. You kept a promise that wasn't even yours to keep." One by one, the soldiers stepped forward, their boots soft on the grass, and saluted her. Each crisp movement felt like a heartbeat, a rhythm of respect that pulsed through the crowd. Edith's knees trembled, but she stood taller, her heart swelling with a mix of sorrow and pride. She wasn't just holding Tommy's dog tag or a plaque. She was holding the weight of every soldier who'd tasted her cookies, who'd read her notes, who'd felt her love in the middle of a war zone. The moment didn't stay quiet for long. Someone in the crowd had captured it all on their phone. The dog tag, the plaque, Langford's salute, Edith's tears. By evening, the video was on social media, spreading like wildfire across platforms. Within days, it had crossed the country, a beacon of quiet heroism in a noisy world. The cookie lady, they called her, the woman who never stopped believing. 8 years of kindness, answered by a helicopter landing on her lawn, a mother's promise fulfilled. News vans lined Main Street, their cameras hungry for a story. National talk shows called, their producers offering airtime. Book deals landed in her mailbox. Magazine features promised her face on glossy covers, and one letter even asked her to throw the opening pitch at a major league game. But Edith, with the same quiet dignity that had carried her through every Friday, said no. She sat in her living room, Duke's head resting on her knee, and looked at her friend Ellie across the coffee table. "I didn't do it for cameras," she said, her voice soft but firm, the same voice that had whispered goodnight to Tommy every evening before he left. "I won't start now." Ellie nodded, her eyes brimming with admiration. Edith returned to her routine, walking Duke through the quiet streets of Fairview, settling into her rocker with a crossword puzzle, baking cookies not every Friday now, but often enough to keep the rhythm of her heart steady. It was her way of moving forward, of honoring Tommy without letting the world's noise drown out her purpose. Yet the world around her shifted. At Zion Baptist Church, where whispers had once followed Edith down the pews, Pastor Graham stood at the pulpit one Sunday, his voice trembling. "We missed it," he admitted, his words heavy with regret. "Not just the cookies, but the faith behind them. Edith reminded us what humble service looks like, and we forgot." The congregation sat in stunned silence, some wiping tears, others nodding in quiet agreement. The whispers stopped. The cold stares that had once met Edith in the grocery store or at the post office melted into warm hugs, handshakes, and soft words of gratitude. At Fairview High, where Edith had spent years serving sloppy joes and apple slices in the cafeteria, the senior class gathered in the gym. Their voices were unanimous, their decisions swift. The annual fundraiser would be renamed the Jenkins Bake Sale. Kindness, they said, travels. Even the local blogger who'd once accused Edith of baking for attention wrote a new post, her words raw with humility. "I got it wrong," she admitted. "Real heroism doesn't always wear boots. Sometimes it wears an apron, dusted with flour, and it works quietly, week after week, expecting nothing." The most poignant tribute, though, rose on the wall of the Fairview Public Library. Local artists, young and old, came together to create a mural that stretched 20 feet across the brick, a tapestry of memory and love. On the left, Edith stood in her kitchen, a tray of cookies in her hands, her face soft with determination. On the right, Corporal Thomas Jenkins smiled in his uniform, bathed in the gentle glow of a painted sunrise. Between them, in golden cursive, 2 words, "Promise kept." The mural became a pilgrimage site. Veterans left flowers at its base, their hands lingering on the bricks. Strangers stood in the grass, weeping quietly for a woman they'd never met, for a son they'd never known. Edith visited the mural once, early in the morning before the crowds arrived. She stood there, Duke's leash loose in her hand, and stared at Tommy's painted face. The breeze stirred her hair, carrying the scent of spring grass. Her heart ached, but it was a softer ache now, laced with peace. "You got them, Tommy," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Just like you said." She smiled, a small private smile, and turned toward home, her steps lighter, her promise fully kept. In a world that races past quiet moments, where headlines flare and fade, Edith Mae Jenkins became a reminder of something eternal. Her cookies weren't just baked goods. They were love, persistence, a mother's heart reaching across oceans. She didn't bake for fame or recognition. She baked because her soul couldn't do otherwise. And in a world drowning in noise, her silence rang louder than any megaphone. What if more of us lived like Edith? What if we poured our hearts into small, faithful acts, expecting no applause? In a time when division shouts louder than decency, maybe what we need is a tray of warm cookies, a note that says, "You matter," a gesture that whispers, "I haven't forgotten you." Edith's story reminds us that one person acting quietly can still change the world. One cookie, one promise, one heart at a time.